Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you all had a restful day and were able to spend time with family, especially with God. And I hope that you had a chance to maybe, read the Bible or do some other things to kind of strengthen yourselves or grow yourself spiritually. So this is another one of my teachings on the Parashah from week to week. This is Parashah 12, which is Vayechi, which in English means he lived. And so we are picking back up with the story of Yaakov, but also with Yosef and his brothers. This ends the book of the Parashah or Genesis, and really it ends the era of the patriarchs, and kind of ties up all the loose ends around, again, Yosef and Yaakov, all his brothers, and really it leads into a kind of a silent period between the end of Bereshit and Shemot, which is Exodus, which will begin next week. So let's go ahead and dive into Parashah 12. And we pick up back at the end of chapter 47, starting at verse 28. There's a few verses left in chapter 47, but these last few verses kind of like a prologue to the rest of Parashah. It kind of explains what the rest of Parashah is about, and it basically talks about the rest of Yaakov's life, and how that rest of his life impacts his sons and what that portrays for the future. So in this prologue, it says Yaakov lived 17 years in Egypt after arriving and then died at the age of 147. So when he arrived in Egypt, he was right around 130 years old. So after leading off with that, the text goes and says that Yaakov made Yosef put his hand on his thigh and make a promise to him. So whenever you, in Middle Eastern and in culture, whenever you put your hand or the thigh or close to the groin area of another person, especially a man, what you're doing is you're basically submitting yourself to them in the most utmost way. It is the utmost sign of utter submission to that person's authority over you and submission to whatever they command you to do. So what was this about? This was about Yaakov wanting Yosef to bury him back in Canaan at the field of Mamre in the cave of Machpelah. Now, all of Yaakov's ancestors are buried there, and Leah's also buried there. Okay? Now, if you remember, Rachel was not buried there because she died on the road to Bethlehem, which actually they get into here in just a little bit. And that's actually her grave. Is actually still, there's a monument there, even to this day, if you go into Israel. All right, so Yaakov has Joseph promise, and when he says, "I'll do whatever you ask," basically, Yaakov makes him swear. He says, "Swear to me." Now, in modern culture, when we say swear something, if you break that promise, you look bad. It's not a good thing. But people usually don't don't always hold over your head, and they don't always remember it. However, in Middle Eastern culture, when you swear, what you're really doing is saying that you promise to do whatever they're asking you to do under penalty of being cursed. So when you swore something, there was really very real penalties to not fulfilling what you promised to do. So Joseph then again agrees to that. He swears, and in that culture, again, Joseph knew exactly what he was doing when he swore to fulfill Yaakov's command. Now, prior to that, Yaakov asked, if you love me, if you'll do this kindness for me, promise you'll do this. And so the word used there is chesed, which means kindness. It's also can be conflated with love and a couple other words, but the primary reason of it, or the primary meaning of it, is kindness. Excuse me. So um, So he's asking, hey, if you'll do this kindness for me, and you'll see the term chesed used throughout the Tanakh and also throughout the rest of the Parashah as well. And it really has kindness. So if you look in 1 Corinthians with the love chapter, it says love, but what chesed really means is kindness. And what kindness denotes is when you say I'm being kind to someone, there's action behind it. It's not just love as in feeling. Kindness doesn't just mean like you feel good feelings towards someone. It means you're showing good action towards someone. And so, and it's really how a lot of your words in Hebrew when in regard to feeling actually are united also with action. You don't in Hebrew and Middle Eastern culture, you don't have a feeling without there being action behind it. If you feel some way, there's action that goes behind it. For example, if I see someone on the side of the road who's obviously starving and in bad straits, I may feel sorry for them. Um, but to show chesed towards them means that I actually go and help them. I don't just feel sorry for them or, feel empathy towards them. I actually go and help them. That is chesed. Okay, so getting back on track here. So um, Joseph promises, he swears to go ahead and do this deed um, for Yaakov. Now, I don't think it really took very much to get Joseph to agree to this. Joseph knows that the land of Canaan is where they belong. And so I don't think, even though Yaakov had him swear to it just to make sure, I don't think Joseph would have had any issue. Now, the only thing I can think of is that Yaakov knew about Pharaoh and knew maybe by watching Pharaoh over the 17 years and be hearing about him, whatever, was worried that Pharaoh may not let Joseph leave to bury him in Canaan or may force Egyptian customs for burial and keeping him in Egypt upon Joseph. And so maybe bearing that in mind, maybe Yaakov was like, I better make him swear just so he would definitely do it and not get talked out or forced out of it by Pharaoh. All right. So after all this, Yaakov bows down his staff and worships. And I can imagine, like I say there was so much for him to be thankful for. He's at the end of his life. It's been a rough life, and some of it he's caused himself. Other things, most has been thrust on him, and he is very much thankful, even for all that he's been through. He's thankful for all the multitudes blessings he's been. And a matter of fact, later on this parashah, he speaks that he's been more blessed than his fathers. And I know it seems kind of weird considering, Abraham being the patriarch that probably was the most righteous out of the three. But the blessings had built, I guess you could say, over generations to the point to where Yaakov was at that point. And so Yaakov realizes that he's got so much to be thankful for. And I'm sure he is, thanking God so much, thanking him for all the things he's done for him, thanking him for Joseph, a son who was willing to, be good to his father and obey his father. Just so many things to be thankful for at the end of his life. All right. So now we move on. We're into chapter 48, and we're going to start talking about the blessings that Yaakov would speak over Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. So Joseph takes his sons with him to go see his father, he's now sick. So Joseph hears, hey, your father's sick. Um, And so he takes his sons with him to go see him. Now, maybe it was just so Joseph could perhaps, let his sons see Yaakov for the last time, or maybe he was anticipating a blessing. Or maybe it was just anticipating Joseph or Yaakov blessing him as Joseph. But maybe he wanted to see perhaps Yaakov would bless his sons as well. I don't know. But those are options for why he brought his sons with him. So whenever the name Yisrael is used instead of Yaakov, there's a reason for that. You'll see throughout Yaakov's life since that meeting with the man at the middle of the night, and he wrestled with, and his name was changed to Yisrael. You'll see where that name is used interchangeably with Yaakov, but it's not just haphazard. It's not just thrown in there for variance, just to make the writing seem more interesting and not as bland. Like I know when we write now, we use different words to try to change up our verbiage so that when people are reading, it's not as boring. It's a little more lively and a little more holding our attention. That's not why Yisrael and Yaakov are used back and forth in this in the passage of scripture since the wrestling with the man in the middle of the night before he met Esav. So the reason why Yisrael is used is whenever he is actually acting in a way beyond himself. He's acting in the power of God. He's acting under the Spirit of God. That is when the name Yisrael is used. That's when he acts. That's when he walks and uses Yisrael instead of Yaakov. So just think about it in a way that where Yaakov is kind of elevated for a time, and that is when he is Yisrael. So, having said that, Yisrael gathers his strength, and again, it just insinuates that it's not just his own strength he's gathering. It says his strength, but it's also insinuated that God is the one helping him to gather whatever last strength he has and to sit up in bed. Remember, he's bedridden, he's sick, and so if he's on his deathbed, sick and dying and bedridden, for him to sit up and to not just talk with Joseph, but to actually, bless his sons and things of that nature, that took a lot of strength at that point in time. And it's a seeming that God is the one who's helping him gather that strength to be able to do his last few acts before he actually dies. Okay. Let's go ahead again. So during his speech, his talking with Yosef, he reiterates the promise of God about the family of Abraham, Yitzchak, and himself. What God always promised to the land of Israel, and also the promise to make him a great nation, to grow him and to make a multitude of multitudes. And so he reiterates this to Yosef. And he's still speaking as Israel. So Israel says that Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are also his sons, not just grandsons. So, and he says later, if you see that further down, that these sons will be counted as if they were Yaakov's sons, not grandsons, for the purpose of inheritance. In other words, this is the way by which Yaakov is giving Joseph a double portion through his two sons. So that's part of it. So again, even though Yehuda all the kings would proceed forth from him, make no mistake here that Yosef is the firstborn. He is the bocher of Yisrael. Okay, and you can see as actually reinforced later when he blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. Um, it's when people go ahead and when Jews recite the blessing that may your son may you be like Ephraim and like Manasseh. That blessing said of their sons every Shabbat. That's said because it kind of points to the double portion, to the utmost blessings that God is giving um, through Yaakov to Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, if you notice, Joseph takes his sons and positions them in a way to where when Yaakov blesses them, he blesses them with Manasseh under Yaakov's right hand and Ephraim under Yaakov's left hand. However, when Israel goes to bless them, he crosses his arms and instead blesses Ephraim as a kind of bocher, and Manasseh as kind of like a second born. and it's kind of reinforced when Yaakov says that Ephraim and Manasseh will be just like his sons Reuven and Shimon. Well, why is that important? Because Reuven was the literal firstborn and Shimon was the secondborn. So what he's saying is that Ephraim will be like Reuven and Manasseh will be like Shimon. Okay? All right. So, Israel also goes on to recount Joseph's mother Rachel dying on the road to Ephrath, which is also Beit Lechem, or Bethlehem, and where they buried her. And it also says to his sorrow. So he reiterates to Joseph that, it was very sorrowful that when Rachel died, almost like he's saying, I haven't forgotten about your mother. And another poignant thing, it kind of stands to me. So Leah, the wife that was the least liked, was buried in Machpelah. However, Rachel was buried on the side of a road in on the way to Bethlehem. And so it's kind of odd, and this is not to be disparaging at all, but it's interesting that the favored wife was not buried in Machpelah, whereas the least favored one was buried and gathered with the rest of the patriarchs and their family. I just found it kind of interesting there. And again, it's not to disparage Rachel in any ways. It's just kind of poignant where she is the one who died and was buried outside and away from the rest of the patriarchs, whereas Leah was not. Now, you could chalk it up to just being convenience where, that was a long distance and Rachel, depending on what kind of condition her body was in, they wouldn't have made it that far. Or maybe there's tradition where you have to bury them within a certain amount of days. I don't know. But it just seemed poignant that that occurred. All right. So now we come to the point where, and this was before the actual blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. So, after he's finished speaking to Joseph earlier, he could see images before him of two little ones, but he had no idea who they were. So he asked, well, whose are these? Well, these are mine, Dad. These are my sons who were born to me in Egypt. Now, I don't know, maybe this, for some odd reason, is the very first time that Israel is meeting his two grandsons, but I seriously doubt that. I think what happened was that Israel was so old and his eyes were failing him so much that he could not recognize his own grandsons. And so, and I don't know, maybe Joseph was announced to his father when he came in the room, by one of his servants. I don't know. But in any case, Yaakov's eyesight was so poor that he could not recognize his grandsons, although he did recognize they were little children. And they were little, and you could tell they were little children because it talks about Joseph taking them off his lap. Um, and I know it seems kind of weird because it talks about it's been 17 years already, and that we talked about these two sons being born prior to the uh, whole narrative about Israel and the rest of his family coming down from Canaan. But in this passage, it says they were on his laps. Well, I can't imagine Ephraim and Manasseh as adults sitting on Joseph's lap. Um, they had to be little children. Um, It also, the way Yaakov says, "Who are these?" It's almost like this grandfatherly, like kind of smile, like it's kind of hard to explain, but I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. When you have that grandfather, like, "Well, who are these? Who are you?" And like before little children, the kind of tone and the kind of way he said it. All right, so Yaakov kisses them and hugs on them, just like he would, and you hug and kiss on your own grandchildren. Um, and he recounts how he never got to even see Joseph again. Now he's even gotten to see his children. And so, I mean, again, more that Yaakov is thankful for him, and it's poignant because if you think back to when Yaakov came before Pharaoh, he said, "Few and evil," or like just of a lot of bad things happening, of the days of my life, and they're nothing compared to my father's. But now we see where he is going through his recognition of all the many blessings that God has given him. So at the end of his life, he's recounting all that God's done for him, and he's in a mood of blessing, and it's completely different than the way he kind of appeared before Pharaoh. Okay, so um, again, but this comes to the point where he's actually going to give out the blessing. And so Joseph go ahead and positions his boys according to the birth order, which ends up not being the order by which Yaakov blesses them. It also talks about the fact that Joseph bowed deeply before his father. Now, that may seem really weird in Western culture. However, in Middle Eastern culture, you bow deeply before those who are greater than yourself. It is a sign of utmost respect. And a lot of it happens towards your elders, or it happens towards your leaders. And it was a sign of utmost respect and submission, which is deeply ingrained in Middle Eastern culture. So again, Joseph crosses hands, blesses them in the reverse order from which Joseph puts his sons forth, to Joseph's objection. And Israel, he understands this. He knows this is the way it usually is. Usually the older gets the double blessing. But he explains that Manasseh will also be a great people too, but Ephraim has been chosen to be greater. And so it wasn't just Israel saying he will be greater. It was God speaking through Israel that Ephraim will be greater. Now, there are 5 times untold throughout Bereshit by which God chooses the younger over the older to be the Bechor. Now, the Bechor was the person who took charge of the father's household when he passed, along with getting that double portion. They were the ones that are supposed to go ahead and teach the father's values, to teach about his gods and everything else. That was the responsibility of the Bechor. And so Ephraim was chosen to be that, even though Manasseh was older. And so God has done this several times, which means that even though culture says firstborn should receive the double blessing and be the one in charge, that was not always how it was. When God saw somebody was more capable, or had more of a reputation, or had more of a moral compass in them, or more of a potential. There's many other reasons too. He went ahead and made that person the Bechor instead of the older. So it says that Yaakov went to bless Yosef. Now that's interesting considering he's not literally blessing Yosef here. He's blessing his boys, while Yosef would be blessed by Israel through his boys. Okay, Joseph's blessing was a double portion being given to his boys. It was the blessing of seeing his boys being elevated to the sons of Israel, not just the grandsons, and for being kind of that top tier, and by which God would give Joseph a double portion. Now, another interesting thing here, as Israel goes and blesses these boys, he talks to the angel who redeemed me and blessed me. Well, the angel who redeemed me and blessed me, why would he be talking about worshiping and giving praise to an angel who redeemed me or blessed me, unless that angel had to do with God? Now, again, we go back further. We look further back in Genesis. We look back at the earlier, the wrestling with the man, before he met Esau for Yaakov. We also look at what happened with Abraham when he hosted the three angels, the three men, before they the one angel went and talked to him about the cities of the valley, being Sodom and Gomorrah. And we talked then about the fact, I'm what choked up tonight. We talked then about the fact that the angel could have been the pre-incarnate Messiah, Yeshua. Now, there's a lot of objection to that. The fact that, God would never become a man. It's like unbecoming of him. And there's a lot of other objections to it. Some of it is just the fact that people hate Yeshua, and so they would never, no matter what logic you showed them, be able to reconcile that. But it's clear here that the angel they're talking about was divine. It was somebody to be worshipped. Well, the only person here to be worshipped ever is God, and so that angel had to be God. And so there's a lot there to unpack, if you're willing to unpack it, or you can just explain it away. And there's people who do it every day, explain away not just this, but the rest of the Bible as well. And so it's always up to us to dig further or explain away. But I'm the firm conviction that this angel that appeared that wrestled with this man, this angel who wrestled with Yaakov, and the one who was with Abraham was the pre-incarnate Yeshua, was the Messiah. Because remember, the Messiah is eternal. And so just because he had not come in the form of man yet did not mean the Messiah was not always there. Okay, so in blessing, Israel says, in Ephraim will be the fullness of the nations. Now, this is interesting, okay, because when you think about the Jewish nation, even though Jews predict the coming of the nations and them all becoming Jews at the end, here it talks about Ephraim becoming the fullness of the nations. Well, why? How? So remember later on, this is like much later, at the end of the first temple, actually before the first temple period is over, you see the northern tribes fall away. They are conquered by Assyria. They're taken captive, and they are scattered all over the earth, to the ends of the earth. Okay? They originally are scattered through Asia and Europe, and then they scatter out further to the utmost ends of the earth, to all the islands, the United States, Australia. The descendants of the northern tribes are everywhere now. Okay? And so it's almost like God is going to use Ephraim, no matter what, by the way. I'm going to talk about it here in just a minute. No matter what, to spread forth the light of the Jewish nation to all of the world. Now, this could have happened without a exile done by Assyria. This could have actually happened a good way. Ephraim could have been sent out and really went out to spread that light. However, it unfortunately happened a negative way where the northern tribes were dispersed because of exile, not because of commission. However, even in that exile, God worked through them to bring light to the rest of the Gentiles. And during that time, many of the northern tribes repented of their rebellion against God and became more, I guess you could say, more committed to Him, more on fire for Him in exile. Okay. And we talked about the blessing, and again, the example of the fullness of God's blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh in blessing our children, our sons on Shabbat to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay. Then there's one more thing that Yisrael says to Yosef. And he said, again, this is all being done away from the rest of the brothers, it's in private. That he also gets another portion, which is a portion that was taken away, that was done by his own sword and bow, a land taken away from the Amorites. Now, the only time we read about the land being taken from the Amorites is the incident with Shechem. If you remember back several Parashah ago, Yaakov's sons went on a killing rampage in Shechem, killing all the men by the sword, taking everything captive, and basically made Yaakov a stench in the eye and the nose of all of the rest of the Canaanites. It doesn't say what happened after that. And what it does say is that they left that area. It doesn't talk about that Yaakov finished taking over the area as his own. But here it definitely talks about land that was taken from the Amorites and is now being given to Yosef as another portion. Could it be Shechem? It could be. It could something come. There could be things that have happened that the Bible either doesn't sketch out fully or was never even mentioned in the Bible. Okay. So now we're to the point where Yaakov has called all his sons in and tells them to listen to his father Yaakov, listen to the voice of Yisrael. That's important because, again, Yaakov was speaking here as Yisrael. To remember, he's speaking that elevated position, speaking in the spirit, God using him to speak to all of his sons. I don't know why I put the remainder of his sons. It's actually all of his sons. Excuse me for that mistake. Okay, so I'm going to go through order. I'm going to go through an order here from the physical oldest to the physical, or to the physical firstborn to the physical lastborn, which is exactly how it is in Bereshit. And basically summarize a blessing and what he said about them. So for Reuven, it says, although endowed with extra dignity and strength, it will basically boil away to nothing because of what he did with Bilhah. Remember that he went ahead, maybe to go ahead and solidify his rank as firstborn, to solidify his power, whatever was going through his head, went ahead and slept with Yaakov's basically wife, his concubine Bilhah, which is a major no-no, and still is now, to go ahead and sleep with your father's wife. That was really bad. It was incest, basically. And so, because of that, even though Reuven should have been endowed with extra dignity and strength, it will all boil away to nothing. He will have none of that. And then we read later in Scripture, he basically does just basically disappear from view. For Shimon and Levi, it talks about his violence and uncontrolled anger. So in almost the whole entire portion of what Israel is talking about with regard to Shimon and Levi, it talks about that situation in Shechem when they tricked the men of Shechem and then went ahead and killed them all. Not only that, also they killed the oxen and everything else there, killed everything. So except for the women and children. And so what Israel is saying here is that I don't even want to be in the secret council because they devise evil things and violent things in their secret council. They're self-willed, they're violent, and have uncontrollable anger. And because of this, it will end up dispersed in the land of Israel. Now, if you remember to the golden calf incident, Levi kind of mitigates this a little bit by exhibiting a behavior far above the rest of his brethren, his descendants. And so the tribe of Levi kind of redeemed themselves by doing what was right when the time demanded it. And so even though they didn't, even so his punishment sort of carried out in the fact that they don't get land of their own. They don't get the land of their own, but they do get the priesthood. And they do end up having land, just not their own. And so even though they are dispersed, it's for a good reason instead of a bad reason. With Shimon, eventually Shimon is dispersed and absorbed into other tribes, and you don't hear much about him anymore at all. Levi is still a tribe recognized easily today, along with Yehuda. The rest of the tribes you don't hear much about anymore. You may know some. There may be some that actually know they're from Benjamin. There may be some other ones that do know they're of a certain tribe, but it's very rare outside of the tribe of Yehuda and Levi. Okay, so continue on. Yehuda, which means praise, shall be praised. Will lead his brothers and conquer all enemies. Others will be afraid to stir him up. Kings will come forth from Yehuda until Shiloh comes. Well, who is Shiloh? Shiloh is Messiah, and the nations will obey Messiah. And so kings will continue to come forth from Yehuda until the last king, Messiah, Yeshua, comes, to whom the nations will obey and to whom will all be gathered together. He will gather together all of Israel back to the land and rule forever. And so from Yehuda basically comes forth the kingdom of the kingship and the leadership and the strength of Israel. Now it may seem kind of weird because Yosef is the Bechor, but Yosef is the Bechor now. But what happens is when the northern tribes are exiled, that kind of is kind of given up to Yehuda, who stays in the land. Now, it's not to say Yehuda and Levi and other ones in the south, Benjamin, were perfect. They weren't. And a matter of fact, the Bible says that if it wasn't for the promises made to David, they would have all been sent to exile, just like the northern tribes were. So it wasn't because of their righteousness that they got kind of a better end of the deal. It was because of the promises made to David. All right, for the son Zebulun will dwell by the seashore. So it basically insinuates that they're going to be sea merchants, fishers, anything having to do with doing anything along the Mediterranean. Maybe some things inside of there, but most of what they're going to do is going to be related to the Mediterranean, the seashore. All right, Yisachar. So there'll be strong workers. Unfortunately, they're going to be willing. to stay in the land, they're willing to do anything. They're willing to do anything to stay in the land, even come up under forced labor. Um, so um, then you come to Dan or Don, a tribe. There will be a tribe of warriors, and that's testified to in Scripture, who will ultimately need to be delivered. And so it's kind of like a foreshadowing of them being the first tribe to apostatize and to start worshiping idols and things of that nature. um, and so they end up being, I think they end up being one of the first tribes to be exiled by the Syrians. Um, and so even though they're a tribe of very strong warriors, they're the ones that will end up needing to be delivered. And not being able to actually fight off. Remember, so in a lot of the battles that happened, the Dan would help with their warriors, and they were known as fierce warriors. And so instead of them delivering others, they themselves need to be delivered. With God or Gad, although they will be attacked, they will be attacked back subtly. Whenever you talk about striking the heel, we've talked about this several Parashah back. But it talks about being subtle, being striking the person where they are the most stable, things of that nature. That is how God would operate, almost like ambushing. For our share, they will bless others by providing for them richly and also with quality. So it says rich foods, but that could be also looked at as not just providing food. Maybe they have great livestock and a lot of other and great crops and all kind of things. It actually is one of the ways they will bless the rest of Israel with their rich crops and what they grow and with all their their fruits and things of that nature. But it also speaks to them actually being a blessing to their brothers by actually just giving to their brothers. And not just, and notice here, it's not just food, it's rich food, it's richly, it's high quality. So with Naphtali, talk about a doe. So a doe who, beautiful doe brings forth beautiful words. So if you think about a doe, it's kind of like this very regal doe, but it can also be one that frolics about, speaking beautiful words. So they can be words of blessing or words of encouragement, maybe songs of worship, but the words that come out of their mouth are beautiful. They're bright, they're shining, they're things, and it's not like just speaking things just to sound eloquent. It's actually true, beautiful words, that the impactful words that come out of their mouth. Now, with Yosef obviously being the Becher, or the Bechor, excuse me, has the longest blessing of all. So it speaks of him being a son who is fruitful, and he's positioned by a spring that strengthens him. But we know that spring is God, right? And he's so fruitful that his branches run along, hang over a wall. It's kind of like an image of a grapevine almost, or maybe a tree that just has long, sprawling branches that hang over the wall. And so it goes on to say that others attack him, but he prevails by the strength of God. And that the shepherd of Israel, the stone of Israel, will help him. Well, when you talk about the stone of Israel, when you talk about the shepherd of Israel, that has messianic overtones. And so it's almost like saying Messiah will be the one to help him. And it kind of speaks to the end, right? Kind of like when God promises to bring all the tribes back to Israel in the end under Messiah. So maybe it's a foreshadow, a prophecy of Messiah helping Joseph by bringing back all the northern tribes, who are sometimes called Yosef, sometimes called Ephraim, back to the land of Israel. So others may attack him if they're going to start attacking Yosef. Well, Yosef's going to die, right? Who's going to attack Yosef when he dies? But if we're talking about the Holocaust, or we're talking about other things where a lot of the northern tribes were scattered to, being attacked, pogroms, things of that happening. This is God helping them to overcome that, and in the end, bringing Messiah to bring them, sending Messiah to bring them back to Israel. Okay. It also has El Shaddai blessing him from the heavens above. It talks about rain and all the blessings from heaven, the sun and things, and then depths below, maybe from what grows out of the ground, and then also of the breast and the womb. So lots of children. Okay, so produce, all the riches from the ground and from the heavens, and also of having children. Okay, so continue on with Yosef. So Yaakov says, although his life was rougher than his father's, he has been blessed in every way more. To the very furthest, he's been blessed. And so, again, we talked about earlier, whereas although most would say Abraham was more righteous than his descendants, Yaakov speaks that he was more blessed than even his fathers, and it's almost like those blessings built over generations. And he says, may all these blessings be upon Joseph, and that he has been set apart above his brothers. Okay, and so now remember, all these brothers are hearing all the blessings spoken over each of them as a whole. This isn't done in just private, where he takes each brother aside privately and tells them their blessing and then sends them out and brings the next one in. No, they're all in the same room, all hearing what's being spoken over each of the other brothers. Okay, so they hear this from Joseph. And remember, this has been a motif we've seen with Joseph's dreams. He talked about, we saw them come to pass with them bowing down to him in Egypt, and now we're seeing the same thing play out again with what Yaakov or Israel is saying. And so again, these dreams just keep being fulfilled in other ways over and over again. All right, so lastly we get to the Binyamin, and the only thing he says about him is he's a ravening wolf. Now, wolves are hunters. They're not scavengers, they're hunters. So it's almost like saying he's a war, and it says later that he devours everything in sight. So like a warrior that devours everything in sight. That's what they talk about Binyamin. And so we see later that there is an instance with Binyamin where his whole tribe was wiped out. And so so we'll get to that here in a later parashah. Actually, we won't. Excuse me, because that actually gets into the books after the Torah. And so I actually will go ahead and I'll get back with you. I believe it's in Yehoshua, but it may be later on. It may be actually in Judges that actually occurs. But where the incident with the tribe of Benjamin and them almost being wiped out, to the point to where the rest of the tribes have to give their daughters to them to kind of build back up the tribe of Benjamin from being wiped out. All right. So at the end it says each brother received a suitable blessing. Now it may not seem like some of them got very much of a blessing, but it says here they received a suitable blessing. In other words, they're getting either what they deserved or they're getting what their future is going to become, sometimes because of what happened in the past. In any case, they're receiving this as what's suitable for them, regardless of what they think of it, whether they think it's fair or not, regardless if we think it's fair or not. It doesn't matter. This is the blessing they're receiving from God. So after this, Yaakov charges them to bury him in the cave of Machpelah with the rest of his ancestors and Leah. So he's already already told Yosef to do it. He's already made Joseph swear to do it. Now he is telling Yaakov to do so. By the way, if you hear my wife making food, this is after Shabbat is over, so we're not violating Shabbat. Okay, back on track. So um, so he's now giving the same charge to the rest of the brothers. Again, just as a reminder, bury me in Machpelah. Don't leave me here in Egypt. Now, why would Yaakov keep re-emphasizing this? Because Pharaoh, first of all, would not want Joseph to leave. He was governor of all Egypt. He would not want him to leave for an extended period of time. Second of all, Pharaoh may not have wanted Israel to leave at all. He may have wanted them to stay in Egypt. Why? Because just like Abimelech recognized that he was being blessed because of Abraham, just like Lavan realized he was being blessed because of Yaakov, Pharaoh probably realized that he was being blessed because of the family of Yaakov. And so he may not want them to leave for that reason. Not only that, but Pharaoh may have wanted to honor Yaakov and give him a burial place there instead of letting him leave to be buried in Canaan. Another thing is letting Yaakov be buried in Canaan instead of Egypt would be almost like saying that Israel had a life outside of Egypt. Pharaoh didn't want them having a life outside of Egypt. And you will see that later in Shemot or Exodus where Pharaoh did not want them to leave. They wanted them to stay and continue to be a blessing to Egypt in whatever manner that took. Okay, so eventually after this, Yaakov does die and he is gathered to his people. Now, when you say gathered to his people, that is a saying. What it basically means is two things. One, being gathered to his ancestors in Sheol, but also, and then eventually they're in paradise because after Yeshua dies and goes down and frees them, they end up in paradise. But anyways, but he's also gathered to his people as far as his sons, his relatives, anybody else. He's gathered there to be mourned over and to be buried. Okay, so we move on to chapter 50, the last chapter in Bereshit. Now we're talking about how they lament over Yaakov. Now, there's a custom in Egypt that Yaakov is not Yaakov, not just Yaakov, but there's a custom in Egypt that those who are important are embalmed. Okay, the reason why they want to embalm them is they want there's this whole thing with Egyptian religion where you're embalmed and you're preserved to make your passage over into the afterlife. Now remember, just because Pharaoh realized that he's being blessed by Yisrael and his family, and just because Yosef told him that God would give him the interpretation, does not mean that Pharaoh all of a sudden started believing that God was the God. In Pharaoh's mind, God, if he existed, was only a god in a pantheon of gods that the Egyptians worshipped. So they still insisted, and maybe Yosef kind of gave into this, where to let Yaakov be embalmed. Maybe it's just to pacify them. Sure, go ahead and embalm him. We don't know exactly why Yosef allowed this to happen when that was not a procedure that was done in Canaan or by Yosef's family or even the ones up in Aram. Okay, so this process took about 40 days. It's about 40 days. Um, so um, so Egypt mourns over him for 70 days. Um, now Now, I don't know if that was a command by Pharaoh or a command by Joseph, or this is a traditional thing that all people in leadership are mourned over for 70 days. I doubt it was a command by Joseph um, because if it was a command by Joseph, that would kind of seem kind of conceited and self-serving, and it just doesn't seem like what something Joseph would do. However, I can see it being a command of Pharaoh. If Pharaoh really respected Yaakov as much as it seems like he did, or at least respected him because of Yosef, he could have went ahead and actually commanded that there be mourning for Yaakov for 70 days. Why 70? Maybe that was a traditional mourning period for in the land of Egypt. All right, so Yosef knows he has to take Yaakov's body back to Canaan for burial, to the cave of Machpelah. And so he elicits Pharaoh's house's help by saying, hey, please tell him that my father made me swear to bring his body back to Machpelah for burial. Now, the reason why, again, is because Pharaoh may not want Joseph to leave and to take Yaakov to Canaan for all the reasons I just discussed a bit ago. So, when Pharaoh hears this, he goes ahead and gives permission for them to leave and take Yaakov there for burial. But he makes a point of saying, as he made you swear an oath. Had he not made you swear an oath, I probably would not have let you leave. Okay? Remember, at this point, even though Pharaoh welcomes Israel with open arms, he does now they are part of Egypt. Pharaoh does not see them as a future for them going back to Canaan. Pharaoh sees them as being part of Egypt, and you're not going to leave Egypt. You're going to stay here in Egypt. Especially because you're blessing me. So when they leave, Pharaoh sends a very large Egyptian entourage with Joseph and his brothers to bury Yaakov. Now, why the large entourage? Why the soldiers? Why all this stuff? Well, first of all, it was to honor honor Yaakov. It was also to honor Joseph. It may also kind of bring glory to Pharaoh that look what I've done for Joseph and for Yaakov. And look how much we care about our people. And also the soldiers may be there to protect them from being ambushed by thieves or marauders. And also it may have been, remember, the Canaanites weren't exactly the greatest, didn't exactly have the greatest thoughts on Yaakov and his family, especially what happened in Shechem. And so it may also have been to protect them from that also. When they came to a certain threshing floor on the western, so they get to the point where they're actually at this threshing floor on the western side of the Jordan. Now, how do I know it's from the western side of the Jordan or the Jordan? Because Moshe is the one who wrote all this. Or it's those who received it from Moshe and wrote it down. However it happened, Moshe was the narrator. Moshe was the one who either had this written or wrote it himself. And he did all this from the eastern side of the Jordan before they crossed. So remember, Moshe was not allowed to cross the Jordan into Canaan. He was forbidden because of what happened with the waters of Meribah. And so he was not allowed to cross, and so he wrote this from the eastern side, not the western side. And when he talks about this incident, he talks the other side of the Jordan. Well, if it's the other side of the Jordan, it has to be the western side, not the eastern. Not only that, but why would Joseph and his whole caravan run around the Dead Sea up the western side, the eastern side of the Jordan, just to cross back over into Canaan to go back south again to bury uh, his father. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so the whole company mourned him for 7 days. It was such a mourning, such a display of mourning, but all the Canaanites were absolutely astounded because all they saw there, it looks like all they actually recognized were Egyptians. I don't think that any of the Canaanites recognized that among the Egyptians there were the family of Israel mourning there also. All they saw was Egyptians, and so they were flabbergasted by the amount of mourning that the Egyptians were doing. Maybe because the Egyptians were usually thought of as more stoic people, or at least thought that way. So they really weren't seen as people who express emotions that way. Usually it was like anger or control, not so much mourning and kind of like soft-hearted emotion. And that would make sense if Egyptians were seen as a very military type people to where they didn't really express emotions that weren't aligned with military type of thoughts. Okay, so Yaakov's sons did what they were commanded and buried him in the cave of Machpelah, and then they all returned to Egypt. They had to. Their sons were still there. Their cattle was still there. Not just their sons, their daughters, their children were there. It doesn't mention if their wives were there or not. The wives could have accompanied the rest of them to Canaan, but that would have meant leaving a bunch of those in Egyptians, to go ahead and actually be caretakers of the children. It may have been that the wives actually stayed, and it just isn't. It's kind of implied and not expressed in the text. But anyways, they were all their family, the rest of their family and their cattle and everything else, their possessions were all back in Egypt. So they had to go back. They couldn't just, and that was also a way for Pharaoh to ensure they came back, along with the soldiers and others to kind of enforce Pharaoh's will. Okay, so now we're in the final part of chapter 50. We are after Yaakov's death. The brothers now are afraid because before this, Yaakov was seen as a barrier between the brothers and Joseph's revenge. That barrier is now gone. So now they were deathly afraid that Joseph's going to go ahead and do whatever he wants to them because Yaakov was not there to prevent it. Okay? So they tell Joseph, hey, before he died, our father said to tell you, please forgive your brothers for what they've done. Now, whether Yaakov really said this or not, whether it was an invention for convenience, we don't know. But regardless, it didn't really matter because Joseph had no intentions on carrying out revenge. Even so, the brothers offer themselves as slaves to stave off Joseph's perceived revenge. They bow down, they offer themselves as slaves. Until Joseph's realizing this, he sees their fear, he sees that they are deathly afraid, they are sure he is out to get them. And so Joseph, it cries. Probably he's like, I can't believe you still think this. I told you things were good. I've taken care of you and your families. I provided for you. I've done all this for you. Why would I do this? I was so going to seek revenge against you. I would have left you on your own. And so he's crying, not just because, he feels compassion for them. He feels sorry for them because they're still condemning themselves because of what happened, and they're thinking that Yosef is condemning them as well. And that's not how Joseph's heart is at this point. Joseph's heart at this point is just, I just want you to survive. I want to take care of you. I want us all to make it back to Canaan. And so, it comes towards the end of his life. Joseph lives to be 110 years old. He was so blessed. He got to see the third generation of Ephraim's sons, and the second generation of Manasseh's were born on his knees. So he has got to see all his children, his grandchildren, his great grandchildren. Um, and so um, let's see. If you think about 8 years, um, let's see here. So about 20 years for his sons, then 20 years for his sons to have children. So that's about 40 years, 40 or 50 years. He got to see his sons. So it's been quite a while. I get to live quite a long time afterwards. Now, it does not say whether Joseph's brothers died before him or after him. I don't remember anything being said here, and I don't remember anything being said in Shemot either, whether his brothers died before or after him. It's conceivable that his brothers died before him. Remember, they are much older than he is, and so they should have been born before. They should have died before he did. Not necessarily, but they should have died before he did. And so Joseph tells his brothers, probably the children of his actual brothers, to take his bones, take his mummy, what wound up being his mummy, back to Canaan when God takes notice of them. Now, it's a very peculiar phrase there, when God takes notice of you. In other words, for a while, it may seem like God doesn't take notice of you. So they may be in Egypt for a while where it seems like God does not take notice of them. It's kind of a foreshadowing of them being stuck in Egypt and pleading with God to leave the nation. Okay? So Joseph finally dies and he's embalmed. Again, it's this Egyptian practice. It could have been to preserve him until he reaches Canaan, but more than likely it's Egyptian practice, the same as he did with Yaakov. Um, and so after this is the end of Bereshit. So this is the end of the patriarch era. It is the end of the first generation of sons era, and so we're entering into an era now where you're eventually get to people who did not know Joseph, who did not know Yaakov, and so there's going to be a separation, and we're going to see the deterioration of the faith of the people during this time, because there's a separation from the anchors, the patriarchs, Joseph and his brothers, that actually kind of held these children to follow the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And so we'll get into this more in Shemot, but this is kind of where we leave off. Next week we pick up in for the next Parashah. We will start with Shemot, which is Exodus. We will get into what happened to the children of Israel after a while, after like a good period after the death of Joseph, and see what transpires. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this Parashah study. I hope you take time, as I always say, to study the scripture, to not just take my word for it. Study it out yourself, learn for yourself. You may notice something that I missed, and that happens. I mean, that happens all the time, where we are able to notice something where other misses, and it's not because the others didn't do their due diligence, not because the other ones didn't study. It's because we're human and we miss things, or sometimes God chooses to reveal things to other people and chooses not to reveal it to you. And the scripture says it's the glory of God to conceal a thing and the glory of God to reveal a thing. And so sometimes he reveals things to some people he doesn't to others. And it's not because they're not necessarily not worthy or necessarily don't deserve it. It's just because of God's providence. Okay. Have any prayer requests? Please go ahead and send them to that email request or that email address right there on your screen. I'll be more than happy to pray for you or those who ask for prayer for. Please only give me the first names of either yourself or those you want prayer for. You don't have to go ahead and give me everything about them. No personal identifiable information. Just general specifics is fine. Anyways, I hope you have a blessed week. Brachot and shalom.